The first thing you noticed wasn't her size. It was the silence that came before it. 4,000 people packed into a converted dockyard warehouse on the outskirts of Osaka, and for one strange second, nobody made a sound. Then the back doors opened, and Yuna Katsuragi stepped through them, and the whole building seemed to lean sideways under the weight of what walked in. She was 780 pounds of muscle wrapped in old silk. A deep crimson robe hung off her shoulders, tied at the waist with a braided rope thick enough to anchor a boat. Her bare feet slapped against the concrete with a sound like someone dropping sandbags, one after another, unhurried, because she had never once in her career needed to hurry. 19 years in the underground fighting circuits of Japan, 44 fights, 44 wins. She had picked up grown men and thrown them off elevated platforms like they were folding chairs. She had ended a bout with a 200-pound wrestler by simply falling on top of him and waiting for the referee to notice he'd stopped moving. Nobody in the circuit called her a fighter anymore. They called her a natural disaster with a fight schedule. She climbed the 3 short steps onto the wooden platform at the center of the room, and the boards groaned under her like a ship taking on water. She raised both arms over her head, and the crowd exploded, stomping on metal bleachers, chanting her name until the overhead lights rattled on their chains. This was her arena, her fortune, her legend, built one broken opponent at a time. Then she opened her mouth and made an offer that would end up costing her more than she'd ever earned in her life. $15,000, she called out, and her voice rolled across the warehouse like thunder rolling off a mountain. For every clean strike that lands on me, I'll pay it myself, out of my own pocket. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Somebody near the front whistled. Bookmakers standing near the exits were already scribbling numbers onto their pads, because this wasn't really a bet. It was a joke with a price tag. The joke's name was Kenji Mizuno. He walked out from the opposite corridor alone. No entourage, no manager barking instructions, no corner team trailing behind him with towels and water bottles. Just a man in a plain white training jacket, black sash knotted at his waist, feet bare against the cold concrete floor. He didn't rush. He didn't posture. He walked the way a man walks into his own kitchen at 2 a.m. for a glass of water, completely unbothered by who might be watching. He weighed 138 pounds. Standing next to Katsuragi, he looked like an optical illusion, like someone had made an error scaling 2 photographs to the same frame. The crowd's laughter got louder as he climbed the platform steps. A few people in the front row actually stood up to get a better look, the way people crane their necks at a car accident. This wasn't a fight anymore in their minds. It was a punchline that hadn't finished landing yet. But something strange happened as Kenji reached the center of the platform and looked up, way up, at the mountain of a woman across from him. He smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not the tight, forced grin of a man trying to convince himself he belonged there. It was calm, almost amused. The kind of smile you wear when you already know how a story ends, and you're simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Katsuragi noticed it too, and for the briefest instant, something flickered behind her eyes. Not fear. She didn't know fear. Not after 19 years of walking through opponents like they were paper. But something close to irritation. Like an itch she couldn't quite place. She shook it off and leaned down toward him, her shadow swallowing him whole under the overhead lights. "You understand the offer, little man?" she said, loud enough for the first several rows to catch every word. 10 seconds from now, you're going to be lying on this platform wondering what happened. And I'm still going to have every dollar of that 15,000 sitting right here. She patted the rope at her waist. Kenji didn't answer with words. He tilted his head slightly, studying her the way a carpenter studies a piece of timber before deciding exactly where to cut it. Not with worry, not with defiance, with simple, quiet calculation. Somewhere in the bleachers, a man turned to the stranger next to him and said what half the arena was thinking out loud. "This is going to be over before I finish my drink." Nobody in that building, not the crowd, not the bookmakers frantically adjusting odds against a 100-to-1 payout, not even Katsuragi herself, standing there with her arms crossed and a grin plastered across her face, had any idea that the bet she'd just made out loud, in front of 4,000 witnesses, was about to become the single worst financial decision of her career. They saw a giant and an ant. They saw an impossible mismatch dressed up as spectacle. What none of them could see yet was the 3 weeks that had already happened before this night. The empty training hall in the hills outside Kyoto. The hundreds of hours Kenji had spent studying exactly how massive bodies move, and more importantly, the split-second moments when they don't move at all. That story started long before tonight, and to understand what was about to happen on that platform, you have to go back to the man himself. Because Kenji Mizuno wasn't just small. He was something the fighting world had never quite figured out how to explain. Long before he ever stepped onto a platform across from Yuna Katsuragi, Kenji Mizuno had already made enemies out of the people who were supposed to respect him most. He grew up in a small dojo above a noodle shop in Kobe, the kind of place where the floorboards had been worn smooth by 3 generations of bare feet. His teacher was a stern, quiet man named Ozawa, who taught traditional jujitsu the way it had been taught for 100 years. The same throws, the same katas, the same rigid sequence of movements repeated until the body stopped questioning them. Kenji questioned them anyway. By the time he was 17, he was already pulling techniques apart in his head, asking why a strike was thrown at a certain angle, why a stance planted the feet a certain way, whether the answer was truth or just habit dressed up as tradition. Ozawa found it disrespectful at first. Then he found it exhausting. By the time Kenji turned 20, he had left the dojo entirely, and Ozawa told anyone who asked that his former student had wasted a gift by refusing to sit still long enough to master it. What Ozawa never understood, what almost nobody understood in those early years, was that Kenji hadn't rejected mastery. He'd rejected the idea that mastery could only live inside one system. He spent the next 4 years traveling. He trained with a boxing coach in Manila who taught him how weight transfers through the hips before it ever reaches the fist. He spent a brutal winter with a wrestling club in Sapporo, learning how bigger men create leverage and, more importantly, how they lose it. He studied fencing footwork from a retired Olympic coach in Yokohama who couldn't understand why a martial artist wanted to learn a European sport, until he watched Kenji apply it and stopped asking questions. He took what worked, he threw away what didn't. And when people asked him what style he practiced, he refused to give it a name for years, until finally, tired of the question, he called it simply the intercepting method. A way of fighting built not around forms, but around timing, distance, and the tiny gaps that open in any movement, no matter how powerful. He said things in interviews that made grandmasters furious. He said a black belt was just a piece of cloth if the man wearing it couldn't adapt in real time. He said tradition was only valuable if it kept evolving, and the moment it stopped evolving, it became a museum piece instead of a living skill. He said most fighters lost not because they were weak, but because they were loyal to a system that no longer served the fight in front of them. Rooms full of masters walked out on him. Federations refused to sanction his matches. Old guard fighters called him arrogant, reckless, a disgrace to the arts he'd trained in. And yet, every time he stepped into a ring or onto a platform, something happened that made all that criticism harder and harder to defend. He won. Not with brute strength, he never had it to spare. Not with size, he was always the smaller man, sometimes absurdly so. He won because he understood something almost nobody else in the fighting world had bothered to learn. That speed and precision, applied at exactly the right half-second, could undo mass that no amount of raw strength could ever hope to move. His fans loved him for the same reasons his critics despised him. He didn't perform. He didn't posture before a fight or trash talk after one. He walked into arenas the way other people walked into grocery stores. And he walked out having rewritten what people thought was physically possible for a man his size. There was a story, the kind that gets repeated so often nobody's sure anymore if it's true, about a night in Yokohama where Kenji faced a 210-pound judo champion who had never lost a match by pin or throw. The fight lasted 4 seconds. Kenji didn't grapple. He didn't try to match the man's strength or his technique. He simply stepped once, at exactly the moment the bigger man's weight had committed forward, and used that momentum against him. The champion hit the mat so hard the crowd heard the air leave his lungs from the back row. That was the pattern, over and over. Kenji didn't fight the man in front of him. He fought the mistake the man was about to make, usually before the man himself knew he was about to make it. By the time word of the Katsuragi bet spread through the underground circuit, Kenji's reputation had already split the fighting world cleanly in half. Traditionalists called him a fraud who got lucky against opponents who underestimated him. Everyone else, the fans packing arenas, the younger fighters quietly studying tape of his matches, the bookmakers who'd learned the hard way never to trust the obvious odds, knew better. They knew that when Kenji Mizuno agreed to a fight, it wasn't bravado. It wasn't desperation for a payday, and it certainly wasn't recklessness. It meant he had already seen something in his opponent that told him exactly how the fight would end. So when the message reached him in Kobe, a woman in Osaka willing to bet $15,000 on the belief that his size made him harmless, Kenji didn't laugh, and he didn't hesitate. He asked only 2 questions. How does she close distance? And how big is the platform? Then he closed the door of his training hall, and for 3 weeks, nobody saw him again. The training hall Kenji disappeared into sat on the edge of a quiet hillside outside Kyoto, a converted rice storehouse with wooden beams darkened by decades of smoke and sweat. There was no sign on the door, no students waiting outside, just a single window that let in a thin slice of morning light, and a dirt path that only 2 other people in the world knew how to find. For the first 3 days, Kenji didn't throw a single strike. He sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by stacks of borrowed film reels, grainy black and white footage of sumo tournaments, underground heavyweight matches, wrestling bouts pulled from dusty archives in 3 different cities. He watched them for hours at a time, rewinding the same 3 seconds of footage over and over until his training partner, a wiry former boxer named Daisuke, thought he'd lost his mind. "You're not even watching the fight," Daisuke said on the second night, watching Kenji freeze a frame of a 400-pound sumo wrestler mid-charge. "You're watching nothing happen." "That's exactly what I'm watching," Kenji said without turning around. He wasn't studying the moments of impact. He was studying the half-second before it. The way a heavy body shifts its weight onto the back foot before committing forward. The way hips rotate a beat ahead of the arms. The way the feet plant wide and the center of gravity drops just before the charge begins. Most people's eyes skipped right past that window. It happened too fast, buried inside a blur of raw motion. But Kenji had learned years earlier that inside every powerful movement, there's a door that opens just before the power arrives. And if you're patient enough and precise enough, you can walk through that door before it ever closes on you. By the 4th day, he was ready to test it. He had Daisuke and a second training partner named Ren strap on weighted vests, 60 pounds each, and charge at him from across the hall, full speed, arms wide, mimicking the same straight-line approach that Katsuragi was known for. Over and over, 50 times, 60 times. Kenji didn't strike back, not at first. He only moved. He sidestepped, pivoted, measured the exact distance needed to let a heavy body pass without ever making contact, adjusting by inches, then by fractions of inches, until the movement stopped feeling like a decision and started feeling like breathing. Ren watched from the corner of the hall each day, and years later, when a martial arts magazine finally tracked him down for an interview, he tried to explain what he'd witnessed in that room. He wasn't training to fight her, Ren said. He was training to not be where she was. We'd run at him full speed, and he'd just vanish. Not far, just enough. Like the air around him bent and let him through. By the second week, Kenji added the second half of the equation. He filled a canvas bag with wet sand until it weighed close to 280 pounds and hung it from a reinforced beam in the ceiling. Every morning, he struck it. Not with the wild, showy power of a man trying to prove something, but with short, compact, driving strikes that seemed almost too small to matter. His knuckles split open within days. He wrapped them, kept training, and they split open again. He wasn't chasing power the way most fighters understood power. A powerful strike lands on a surface and stops there, absorbed by muscle and fat and mass. Kenji wasn't interested in stopping at the surface. He was training for penetration. A strike that traveled past the armor of size and reached the parts of the body that didn't care how much a person weighed. The joints, the nerves, the joints, the nerves, the narrow structural points that answered only to physics, no matter how much muscle surrounded them. There was one combination he drilled more than any other, until it stopped being two separate movements and became a single unbroken motion, like one word spoken without a breath in between. A low sweep aimed at the ankle, immediately followed by a rising palm strike to the center of the chest. He ran it slow, then fast, then slow again, hundreds of times, until his body could throw it without his mind needing to give the order. Daisuke asked him once, near the end of the second week, if he was worried. $15,000 a strike sounded generous right up until you remembered the size of the woman standing across the platform from you. Kenji considered the question for a moment before answering. She spent 19 years training people to be afraid of her size, he said. Nobody's ever trained her to defend against someone who isn't. On the morning of the 21st day, Kenji folded his training jacket and placed it carefully into a canvas bag beside a black sash worn soft from years of use. He walked out of the storehouse without looking back at the dented sandbag still swaying gently from its beam, without a word to Daisuke or Ren, who stood by the door watching him go. The preparation was finished. Every rep, every frame of film, every split knuckle had built toward a single question that only 20 seconds on a lit platform in Osaka could answer. Whether 3 weeks of invisible work could survive one night against 780 pounds of momentum aimed directly at him. Section 4. The night the arena shook. Kenji arrived at the venue 6 hours before the doors opened to the public. The building was a converted dockyard warehouse on the industrial edge of Osaka, all exposed steel rafters and concrete walls streaked with years of damp. Wooden bleachers had been bolted into welded metal frames along 3 sides, and at the center of the floor, raised 2 feet off the ground under 4 hanging lamps, sat the platform. 12 feet by 12 feet. Hardwood, scarred and dented from years of bodies hitting it at speed. This was where Katsuragi had ended 11 straight fights without ever needing a 12th round. Kenji walked through the empty building alone, his footsteps bouncing off the concrete and returning to him like echoes down a well. He set his bag against the far wall, climbed the platform steps, and stood barefoot in the center. He wasn't admiring the space. He was measuring it, pacing off the distance from corner to corner, crouching to press his palm flat against the grain of the wood, dragging his foot across the boards to feel exactly how much grip the surface would give him under pressure. Then he returned to the center, closed his eyes, and went still. A maintenance worker sweeping the far bleachers later described what he saw to a local reporter. He said the small man stood motionless in the middle of that platform for almost 15 minutes, not stretching, not shadowboxing, not doing anything a fighter was supposed to do before a match. Just standing there, breathing slowly, like he was listening for something buried underneath the wood. 4 hours later, the weigh-in turned the whole event into something close to a comedy. Katsuragi stepped onto the industrial scale first, her crimson robe shifting around her frame as the needle swung hard to the right before finally settling. 780 pounds. She stepped off without even glancing at the number. She'd carried that weight for years. It wasn't a statistic to her. It was a weapon she'd already tested against 44 opponents and never once had it fail her. Kenji stepped on next. The needle barely moved. 138 pounds. A woman from the local press let out a short laugh before catching herself. One of the officials looked down at the 2 numbers on his clipboard, blinked, and passed the sheet along to the judges' table without saying a word. The gap between the 2 fighters, 642 pounds, looked less like a matchup and more like a mistake somebody would need to correct before fight time. Katsuragi watched the reactions ripple through the room and let herself enjoy every second of it. This was exactly the theater she'd built her career on. A room full of people who already assumed her money was safe before either fighter had thrown a single strike. She cracked her knuckles one at a time, slow and deliberate, the sound popping through the quiet room like distant firecrackers. By 7 that evening, every seat in the warehouse was filled. 4,000 bodies packed into bleachers that groaned under the shifting weight of the crowd. The overhead lamps buzzed faintly. The platform sat empty under the light, waiting. Then the corridor doors opened, and the building felt her before it saw her. A low vibration rolled through the concrete floor, up through the bleacher frames, into the legs of everyone sitting closest to the aisle. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, unhurried. The kind of footsteps that didn't need to rush because nothing in the room was capable of making them. Katsuragi emerged flanked by 3 handlers in matching black jackets, though nobody in the crowd looked at them. Nobody could look away from her. 780 pounds of crimson silk and braided rope moving toward the platform like a tide nobody could redirect. She climbed the 3 wooden steps, and each one groaned beneath her. She reached the center, planted her feet, and raised both arms overhead. The crowd detonated, stomping, chanting her name so loud the hanging lamps swayed gently on their chains. Then the opposite corridor opened, and Kenji Mizuno walked out alone. He moved through the noise the way a stone moves through water, completely untouched by it. White training jacket loose on a frame that looked almost fragile under the arena lights, black sash knotted at his waist, bare feet silent against the cold floor. He climbed the platform steps without pausing and took his mark across from her. The cheering thinned the way a fire thins when it runs low on air. Nobody quite knew what to do with the image in front of them. On one side of the platform stood a woman wider than most doorways. On the other stood a man who looked like he could comfortably stand inside her shadow, with room to spare. Katsuragi looked down at him, tilting her chin to meet his eyes, and a slow grin spread across her face. Not warm, not respectful. The look of someone sizing up something small and deciding it wasn't worth the concern. $15,000, little man, she called out, loud enough for the first several rows to catch every word. Every clean strike. I'll pay it myself. She leaned forward slightly. You'll leave here with exactly what you walked in with. Nothing. Kenji looked up at her, that same calm, faintly amused expression still resting on his face. He didn't answer. He didn't shift his weight or clench a fist or offer the crowd anything to chant back at her. He simply stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, and let her words dissolve into the noise of 4,000 people who had already decided how this would end. The referee stepped between them, raised a hand, and the arena fell into a silence so complete it felt like the whole building was holding one breath at the same time. His hand came down. Looks like you already have Section 4 above. I'll take this as the go-ahead for Section 5, the finale. Here it is. 780 pounds moving at full speed is not something the human brain processes calmly. It doesn't matter how many times you've seen it before. Katsuragi launched off her back foot the instant the referee's hand dropped, both arms wide, fingers spread, closing the distance in a straight line the way she always did. The way that had ended 44 fights before this one. The platform didn't just shake under her, it sang, wooden boards groaning like a hull taking on water. In the front rows, people flinched backward without meaning to, some old instinct in the spine screaming, "Move!" when something that large commits to motion. 3 seconds in, Kenji stepped left. One motion, smooth, tight, almost lazy, like a door swinging open on a perfectly oiled hinge. Katsuragi's mass carried her forward and past him, her right side opening for less than half a second, and his fist was already there before the gap had fully appeared. 2 compact strikes into the ribs, thrown from the hip, every ounce of his 138 pounds threaded into each one. The sound was sharp and heavy at once, like a cleaver hitting a wooden block. 2 clean strikes. $30,000. 3 seconds gone. Her momentum carried her to the platform's edge. She caught herself with one foot on the border, spun, and reset. And her face showed nothing. No pain, no acknowledgement, nothing the crowd could read. She'd absorbed harder hits than that in her career and walked away laughing. She came again, tighter this time, arms drawn in closer to her body. She had already adjusted. This wasn't just size. This was 19 years of instinct correcting itself in real time. 7 seconds in, Kenji didn't sidestep. He dropped his weight low, shifted back half a step, and drove a single low kick into the front of her knee. Not the thigh, not the muscle padding that had absorbed everything else thrown at her that night, but the joint itself. The one part of the human body that doesn't negotiate with mass. It doesn't care what you weigh. It only answers to leverage and angle. And Kenji had spent 3 weeks in an empty storehouse making sure he understood both better than she did. Her leg buckled. For the first time in 19 years, Yuna Katsuragi's stride broke mid-charge. The crowd's chanting cracked into confused murmuring, 4,000 people trying to process something their eyes hadn't been built to expect. Katsuragi caught herself on one knee, planted a hand against the platform floor, and pushed back upright, jaw tight now, the easy confidence from the weigh-in replaced by something sharper. She'd felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Doubt. She came a third time, slower now, more careful, arms tucked in, trying to close the gap without giving him the angle he needed. But that hesitation was exactly the door Kenji had spent 3 weeks learning to walk through. The moment her weight settled onto her back foot, the moment before commitment, he moved. The same low sweep he'd drilled hundreds of times in that quiet hall outside Kyoto, aimed at her ankle, followed immediately by a rising palm strike into the center of her chest. The two motions fused into one continuous line, like a single word spoken without a breath between syllables. She staggered, not fell. Katsuragi was too experienced, too strong, too used to absorbing impact to simply drop. But she staggered, arms pinwheeling for balance on a platform that had never once made her feel unsteady in 11 fights. The crowd went silent. Actually silent. 4,000 people who moments earlier had been screaming her name, now leaning forward in their seats, trying to understand what they were watching. Kenji didn't press the advantage the way people expected. He didn't chase her down or try to finish anything dramatically. He simply reset his stance, hands loose at his sides, and waited. The same calm, faintly amused expression on his face that he'd worn since he first walked through the corridor doors. Like the outcome had never once been in question for him. Katsuragi straightened, breathing harder now, robe slipping slightly off one shoulder. She looked down at him. Really looked. The way you look at something you've badly misjudged. And for just a moment, the mask of absolute confidence she'd worn for 19 years cracked. The rest of the fight unfolded the way water finds a crack in stone. Patient, inevitable. Every time she committed her weight forward, Kenji found the half-second window where 280 pounds of trained mass simply wasn't fast enough to correct itself. He didn't need power. He'd built his entire method around the idea that he never would. He needed precision and timing, and 21 days of studying exactly how a giant moves in the moments a giant doesn't think anyone is watching. When it was over, Katsuragi stood at the center of the platform she had built her fortune on, breathing hard, one hand pressed against ribs that would carry bruises for weeks, staring down at a man less than a fifth of her size who hadn't so much as broken a sweat. The silence in the warehouse lasted a long time before anyone remembered how to cheer. Nobody in that building would forget what they'd just watched. Not the bookmakers scrambling to explain payouts nobody had prepared for. Not the 4,000 people who'd walked in convinced the outcome was a formality. And certainly not Katsuragi herself, who reached for the braided rope at her waist and, for the first time in 19 years, had absolutely nothing left to say. Kenji Mizuno stepped off the platform the same way he'd stepped onto it. Alone, unhurried, already thinking about whatever came.